Man shared shelter with a bear during a storm, then it returned with a stunning surprise. The wind howled through the towering evergreens of the Olympic National Forest, a relentless force that bent branches and sent leaves spiraling into the darkness. Rain slashed through the canopy, drumming against the earth in an unrelenting downpour. Alex Carter tightened his hood, his breath visible in the frigid air as he trudged along the narrow path. His boots sank into the softened mud, each step growing heavier. He had planned to return to his base camp hours ago, but the storm had rolled in faster than expected, swallowing the late afternoon sun beneath thick, churning clouds. Now, lost in the dimming light, he realized he had severely miscalculated his timing. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the wilderness for a fleeting second before plunging it back into shadow. The sharp crack of thunder followed, rolling over the mountains like an avalanche of sound. Alex clenched his jaw. He needed shelter. Pulling out his map and flashlight, he squinted through the heavy sheets of rain. The paper was damp, the ink smudging at the edges, but he could still make out the faint markings. There was a rocky ridge less than a mile north. With any luck, he'd find an outcrop or, if he was fortunate, a cave to wait out the storm. Pressing forward, he kept his head down, his camera equipment secured tightly in his waterproof pack. The forest was eerily silent beneath the fury of the storm, the usual night sounds drowned out by the wind's ferocious howl. The scent of wet earth and pine filled his nostrils, mixing with the dampness that clung to his clothes. His fingers were numb, gripping the straps of his backpack as he pushed forward, his pulse steady despite the isolation pressing in on him. After what felt like an eternity, he spotted it. A jagged rock formation jutting out from the mountainside, its base obscured by tangled undergrowth. Relief flooded him. If he could find a dry spot within, he could warm up, reassess his bearings, and figure out his next move. With renewed determination, he forced his way through the brush, his clothes catching on brambles as he climbed over slick, moss-covered stones. The entrance to the cave loomed ahead, a dark, yawning mouth carved into the rock. He hesitated at the threshold, listening carefully. The sound of rain pelting against the forest floor was deafening, but inside the cavern, there was only silence. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing smooth walls glistening with moisture and a floor dusted with scattered leaves. It seemed empty. Alex exhaled, stepping inside. The air was cool but dry, a welcome reprieve from the storm's fury. He pulled off his backpack, shaking off the excess water before crouching near the entrance to remove his soaked gloves. He had barely begun to relax when a low, guttural sound rumbled from the depths of the cave. Every muscle in his body went rigid. The growl wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that sent ice crawling up his spine. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his flashlight toward the sound. The beam trembled slightly in his grip, revealing a hulking figure nestled deeper within the cavern's shadows. His breath caught in his throat. A grizzly bear. The animal was immense, its broad frame partially curled against the stone. Alex's pulse pounded in his ears. The bear's eyes glowed in the artificial light, dark and unreadable. Another growl rumbled from its chest, more of a warning than a threat. Alex remained frozen, instinct screaming at him to back away slowly, to retreat before he made a fatal mistake. But something made him hesitate. The bear wasn't attacking. It wasn't lunging or baring its teeth. It simply watched him, its massive body rising and falling with labored breaths. That was when Alex saw it. The deep, crimson wound slashed across its shoulder, the fur matted with blood. His heartbeat slowed just enough for reason to slip through the initial panic. The bear was injured. His mind raced. A wounded animal was unpredictable, dangerous, but the bear hadn't tried to move toward him. Its growl had been defensive, a warning to stay back, not a declaration of attack. He adjusted his stance, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. His fingers instinctively found the zipper of his backpack, where his first aid kit was tucked away. This was madness. Helping a bear? Any sane person would have left the cave immediately, but Alex couldn't turn away. He had spent his life documenting wildlife, capturing their untamed beauty through the lens of his camera. But this was different. This wasn't an image to be taken. This was a moment that demanded action. Carefully, he knelt and opened his pack, pulling out the small metal case. The bear watched him, its breathing shallow but steady. Alex swallowed hard, keeping his voice low and calm. "Easy, big guy," he murmured, knowing full well the bear didn't understand his words, but hoping the tone might carry some sense of peace. He unlatched the case, retrieving a bottle of antiseptic and clean bandages. The rain continued to hammer the forest outside, wind howling through the cave's entrance like a ghostly whisper. Alex inched closer, just enough to see the full extent of the wound. It was deep but not fresh. It had already begun to clot, though infection was a real risk. Steeling himself, he poured a small amount of antiseptic onto a cloth. The sharp scent filled the air as he extended his hand slightly, offering it to the bear in a strange gesture of trust. The animal flinched but did not lash out. Taking that as a sign, Alex gently pressed the cloth to the wound. The bear growled, its muscles tensing, but it did not strike. Alex exhaled. "That's it. Just hold on." He worked quickly, cleaning the wound with careful, deliberate movements. Each second felt impossibly long, but the bear remained still, its breathing heavy but measured. When the worst of the cleaning was done, Alex wrapped the wound in bandages, securing them as best as he could. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than letting infection fester. Finally, he sat back, his heart still hammering, but now for an entirely different reason. He had just treated a wild grizzly. The reality of it settled in his chest, equal parts exhilaration and disbelief. The bear watched him for a moment longer before shifting slightly, its head lowering back toward its paws. Alex took the cue, retreating to the other side of the cave, giving the creature space. The storm outside continued its relentless fury, trapping them both in this strange, silent truce. He leaned against the stone wall, exhaustion finally creeping in. He had come here seeking shelter from the storm. What he had found was something far more profound. As sleep began to tug at his consciousness, Alex knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The fire in Alex's chest had simmered into a strange, steady warmth, a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. He had just tended to a wounded grizzly bear, an act that should have been reckless, foolish even. Yet the bear had not struck him down. The storm outside continued to roar, a violent symphony of wind and rain, trapping them in the cave together. He shifted against the cool rock wall, his muscles aching from the tension of the last few hours. Across from him, the bear lay still, its massive body rising and falling in slow, heavy breaths. Its eyes were half-lidded, watching but not menacing, as if still processing the man who had dared to come close. Alex wasn't sure if the bear's acceptance of his presence was because of its injury or something else entirely. The idea that there could be an unspoken understanding between them was both thrilling and humbling. He reached into his pack, fingers finding a protein bar, the wrapper crinkling in the silence. Carefully, he unwrapped it and took a bite, the bland taste hardly registering. He considered tossing a piece toward the bear but hesitated. Wild animals needed to stay wild. Feeding it would be crossing a line. Instead, he simply chewed, the rhythmic motion grounding him in the reality of the situation. The bear shifted slightly, wincing as the bandaged wound pressed against the cave floor. Its ears flicked, nose twitching, as if scenting something in the air. Alex's mind flickered with worry. If the injury was worse than he thought, if infection set in, there would be nothing he could do out here. He needed to get back to civilization, to find help, not just for himself, but for the bear that now, inexplicably, felt like his responsibility. The wind howled through the cave's entrance, sending a shiver down Alex's spine. His clothes were still damp, the chill seeping into his bones. He shifted, trying to find a more comfortable position, but the uneven ground did little to offer comfort. Across from him, the bear let out a deep exhale, a sound that was almost content, almost trusting. The mere thought made Alex's chest tighten. This was unlike anything he had ever experienced. As a photographer, he had spent years observing wildlife from a distance, capturing their majesty through a lens. But this was different. He wasn't just witnessing nature, he was part of it, woven into the fabric of survival alongside this wounded creature. His fingers absent-mindedly brushed against his camera, but he made no move to lift it. Some moments weren't meant to be captured, only lived. Passed. The fire in the sky long extinguished, leaving the world cloaked in utter darkness. The storm had not weakened. If anything, it had grown stronger. The wind shrieking through the trees outside, rain pounding against stone and earth. Sleep tugged at Alex's senses, but he fought it off, unwilling to let his guard down completely. The bear, however, had surrendered to exhaustion. Its head rested on its massive paws, breaths deep and slow, the rise and fall of its body rhythmic and steady. The sight filled Alex with an odd sense of reassurance. If the bear could trust him enough to sleep, then maybe, just maybe, they weren't enemies here. His eyelids grew heavier, the weight of the day settling over him. The cold was still present, but the cave's natural insulation kept it from being unbearable. Slowly, hesitantly, he allowed his body to relax. Just a little, just enough to rest his eyes. The next time he stirred, the storm had not yet passed, but something else pulled him from the edge of sleep. A sound, soft, hesitant, yet persistent. Alex blinked, his senses sluggish as he adjusted to the dim light filtering through the cave's entrance. Then he heard it again, a faint whimper, barely audible over the storm. His breath caught. It wasn't coming from the bear in front of him. Slowly, carefully, Alex sat up, muscles stiff from the cold. He turned his head toward the deeper part of the cave, where the darkness was thickest, impenetrable, without the aid of his flashlight. Another small sound echoed, this time more distinct. A realization hit him like a bolt of lightning, sending a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. There was something else in the cave. His heartbeat quickened as he reached for his flashlight, his fingers steady despite the surge of anticipation flooding his system. Flicking it on, the beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating the stone walls and scattered leaves. His breath hitched as his light landed on a small, trembling figure huddled near the back of the cave. A cub, a tiny grizzly cub, no bigger than a medium-sized dog, its fur damp and matted, its round eyes wide with fear. Alex's pulse roared in his ears. The pieces clicked together in an instant. The mother bear hadn't just been wounded. She had been protecting something, protecting someone. The cub let out another small whimper, shifting on unsteady legs, clearly torn between curiosity and fear. Its dark eyes darted from Alex to its mother, as if waiting for reassurance. The mother bear had stirred at the sound, her deep brown eyes opening, blinking sluggishly before locking onto her cub. A low, soft rumble vibrated through the cave, not aggressive, but concerned. The cub hesitated for only a moment longer before scampering toward her, pressing its small body against her massive form. Alex exhaled, his grip on the flashlight loosening. The situation had just changed entirely. It wasn't just about the injured bear anymore. It was about the cub that depended on her. A new urgency gripped him. The mother needed to survive, not just for herself, but for the tiny life that now huddled beside her, its small head tucked into the crook of her uninjured side. Alex rubbed his hands over his face, mind racing. He needed a new plan. He had to get out of here and find help. Staying was no longer an option. But how could he leave them like this? The mother was still weak, the wound still fresh. If she couldn't recover fast enough, the cub would be left alone, vulnerable to the brutal realities of the wild. His stomach clenched at the thought. He had spent his life documenting nature's beauty, but he had also seen its merciless cruelty. If he left now, there was no guarantee the mother bear would make it through the next few days. No certainty that the cub wouldn't wake up one morning to a cold, unmoving form beside it. He wouldn't let that happen. Determination solidified in his chest, washing away hesitation. He had to get to the ranger station, no matter how treacherous the journey. They would know what to do. They had resources, knowledge. He could explain the situation, lead them back here. Carefully, he reached for his pack, double-checking his gear. His GPS, though damp, was still functional. His food supply was low, but that didn't matter now. What mattered was getting help, fast. He cast one last glance at the bears. The mother had closed her eyes again, her breathing deep and steady. The cub, however, was watching him, silent, unmoving. as if it understood that he was about to leave. Alex swallowed hard. "I'll be back," he murmured, though the words felt strange, almost foolish, spoken aloud. But he meant them. He had to. With that, he adjusted his pack, took a deep breath, and stepped toward the mouth of the cave where the storm awaited him. It struck Alex like a living thing the moment he stepped out of the cave, its icy fingers clawing at his exposed skin, howling through the trees with a force that made him brace himself against the rock wall for stability. Rain lashed at his face, each droplet like a shard of glass against his frozen cheeks. The storm had not weakened, if anything. It had grown fiercer, the sky an endless swirl of dark clouds and flashing lightning, the ground beneath him thick with mud and scattered debris from the forest's relentless battle against the elements. He clenched his jaw, pulling his hood tighter around his face, knowing that hesitation was not an option. The mother bear and her cub depended on him now. The thought sent a new wave of determination through him, pushing aside exhaustion and uncertainty. He secured his backpack, double-checked the GPS strapped to his wrist, and forced himself forward into the merciless storm. Every step was a struggle. The forest, which had once felt like a familiar, breathtaking expanse of nature, now loomed around him like a labyrinth of shifting shadows and ghostly figures. Trees bent and groaned under the weight of the wind, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. His boots sank deep into the waterlogged earth. Every movement met with resistance, as though the very forest itself was trying to keep him from leaving. His pulse pounded in his ears, his breath coming in short bursts as he navigated the treacherous terrain. His original trail had been erased by the storm, leaving him to rely solely on his instincts and the flickering signal of his GPS. Lightning illuminated the landscape in a burst of eerie white, revealing the path ahead. A narrow ridge lined with jagged rocks, the ground slick with rain and treacherous with hidden drops on either side. He hesitated only for a fraction of a second before pushing forward, his heartbeat steady but his muscles coiled with tension. One wrong step and he could slip, tumble into the unseen depths below. He forced his mind to focus, tuning out the storm's deafening wail, forcing his feet to move with careful precision. Time lost meaning in the relentless march through the storm. Minutes felt like hours, the distance stretching endlessly before him, but he didn't stop, couldn't stop. Then a sound cut through the chaos, sharp and unexpected. A growl, not the deep, exhausted rumble of the injured bear he had left behind, but something different, something more menacing. His pulse spiked as he froze mid-step, scanning the darkness with narrowed eyes. The rain distorted sound, making it difficult to pinpoint the source, but he knew one thing: he was not alone. The forest was filled with predators, and while black bears and mountain lions were common in these parts, the grizzlies were the true kings of the wild. If one had caught his scent, if it saw him as a threat or worse, as prey, there would be no negotiation, no truce like the one he had found in the cave. Slowly, carefully, he reached for the knife strapped to his belt, his fingers cold and stiff as they curled around the handle. The underbrush rustled, branches snapping under unseen weight, something moving just beyond the limits of his visibility. His breath came in slow, controlled exhales, his body a coil of waiting energy. Then, in the brief flicker of another lightning strike, he saw it, a pair of glowing eyes reflecting back at him from the darkness. Large, too large for a mountain lion, too calculated for a frightened deer. The creature shifted, muscles rippling beneath wet fur, a hulking shadow against the storm-lashed trees. It was a bear, but not the one from the cave. This one was uninjured, powerful, its stance aggressive, a territorial male. Alex knew the rules. Don't run, don't turn your back, stand your ground, make yourself large, speak in a firm, calm voice. But knowing and doing were two very different things when facing down the raw force of nature itself. His fingers tightened around the knife, his other hand slowly raising in what he knew was a useless attempt to appear larger. The bear let out a warning huff, a deep, guttural sound that sent a shiver through Alex's core. It was sizing him up, deciding whether he was worth the effort, whether he was a threat or just another fool who had wandered too deep into the wild. "Easy," Alex murmured, his voice barely carrying over the wind. The bear took a step forward, its massive paws sinking into the mud with an audible squelch. Another step. Alex's muscles screamed at him to run, to break into a sprint and put as much distance between them as possible. But he forced himself to remain still, to hold his ground despite the primal fear curling in his gut. The bear sniffed the air, nostrils flaring, eyes locked onto him with an eerie intelligence. Another rumble of thunder shook the ground beneath them, and for a moment, Alex thought the storm itself might be enough to send the animal retreating. Quickly as it had appeared, the bear made its decision. With one last assessing glance, it let out a snort and turned, disappearing back into the shadows of the trees. Alex didn't dare move until the sound of its retreating footsteps faded into the storm's symphony. Only then did he let out a shuddering breath, his grip on the knife loosening as the adrenaline drained from his limbs. He had been lucky. He wasted no time moving forward, his pace quickening despite the treacherous ground. His encounter had cost him precious time, and every second mattered. The ranger station had to be close now, tucked somewhere beyond the next ridge. His exhaustion was a distant thing, buried beneath the sheer necessity of the moment. Then through the blur of rain and darkness, he saw it, a glow, artificial, golden against the cold blue of the storm. Hope surged through him. The station. With renewed energy, he pushed himself harder, nearly slipping as he stumbled onto the gravel path, leading up to the wooden structure. His hands were shaking as he pounded on the door, the force of his own desperation startling even him. The door swung open, revealing a man in uniform, his eyes widening at the sight of Alex's drenched, wild-eyed form. "Help!" Alex gasped, his voice hoarse from the wind. "Injured bear! A cub! They need help!" The ranger didn't hesitate. Within moments, the station was alive with movement. Radios crackling, maps unfurled, equipment gathered. Questions were asked, answered in rushed, breathless sentences. Coordinates were relayed, a plan set into motion. Relief warred with the lingering adrenaline in Alex's veins. He had made it. The mother bear and her cub had a chance. As he slumped into a chair, the warmth of the station seeping into his frozen bones, he realized something with startling clarity. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about something far greater, something that had been stirring in his chest since the moment he first saw that wounded bear in the cave. It was about responsibility, about the delicate, unspoken bond between humans and the wild. And for the first time in his life, Alex Carter understood exactly what he was meant to do. The ranger station buzzed with urgent energy as Alex sat wrapped in a heavy blanket, the warmth from the nearby wood stove seeping into his frozen limbs. His fingers still trembled from the cold and the lingering adrenaline of his encounter in the forest, but his mind remained sharp, replaying every detail he had given the rangers about the wounded grizzly and her cub. Across the room, Ranger Ethan Hayes, a tall man with graying hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, studied the map pinned to the wall, his keen eyes darting over the marked locations. Beside him, a younger Ranger, Maria, adjusted her radio, speaking in clipped tones as she coordinated with a wildlife rescue team. The storm outside had not yet relented, but their decision had already been made. The bears couldn't wait. If the mother weakened further or if another predator found them, the cub would have no chance of survival. They had to act now. Alex pushed himself upright, the exhaustion threatening to drag him down, but the urgency of the situation fueled him. "I can take you there," he said, his voice rough from the hours spent battling wind and rain. Ranger Hayes turned to him, his expression unreadable for a moment, before he gave a curt nod. "You'll guide us in, but you stay behind once we get close. If that mother bear feels threatened, it could turn dangerous fast." Alex understood the warning, but nodded regardless. He had no intention of making things worse. He just needed to make sure they got there in time. Within minutes, the team was moving. Flashlights cut through the thick curtain of rain as they loaded gear into the ranger truck, the tires spinning briefly in the mud before gripping solid ground. Alex sat in the back, the seatbelt digging into his shoulder as he watched the trees blur past, his pulse thrumming in time with the engine's steady growl. The vehicle jostled over the uneven road, headlights casting eerie shadows against the towering pines. The deeper they drove, the rougher the path became, until the road disappeared entirely into a dense stretch of forest. They stopped. "We hike from here," Hayes said, stepping out into the rain. Alex followed suit, his boots sinking into the soaked earth as he adjusted his pack. The wind had not lost its fury, howling through the trees like a restless spirit, but they pressed forward, their movements purposeful. Each step felt heavier than the last, but Alex barely noticed. His mind was fixed on the bears, on the cub's fragile frame huddled against its mother. He had to believe they were still alive. For nearly an hour, they trekked through the storm-lashed wilderness, the weight of the moment pressing on them like the low-hanging clouds above. And then finally, they reached the familiar rise of jagged rock, the mouth of the cave barely visible in the swirling darkness. Alex halted, lifting a hand to signal the others. He strained his ears against the wind, listening. Silence, save for the storm. No growls, no movement. His stomach clenched. Had they come too late? Ranger Hayes motioned for Maria to stay back as he carefully moved forward, his rifle slung over his shoulder, but his hands relaxed. No one wanted to use force, but they had to be prepared for anything. Alex barely breathed as the older ranger stepped to the cave's entrance, shining his flashlight into the depths. Then a sound, a low, tired huff. Relief flooded Alex so quickly he nearly staggered. They were still there. "She's weak," Hayes murmured, keeping his voice low. "But she's alive." He stepped back, allowing Maria to radio in the update. The mother bear shifted slightly, her massive body curled protectively around the cub. Her breathing labored but steady. Even from where he stood, Alex could see the exhaustion in her movements, the barely restrained wariness in her dark eyes. She was watching them, but she didn't have the strength to rise. "We sedate her," Hayes decided after a tense moment, glancing at Maria, who nodded and retrieved the tranquilizer rifle from her pack. "It's the only way we can treat her properly." Alex clenched his jaw but said nothing. He understood the necessity, but seeing the bear like this, vulnerable and helpless, stirred something deep inside him. The cub let out a small, distressed noise as Maria took careful aim. The dart struck with a soft thump, and the mother bear flinched but did not lash out. Slowly, her breathing grew deeper, her muscles slackening as the sedative took effect. Hayes waited a moment before stepping inside, motioning for the others to follow. The cave smelled of damp earth and fur, the scent of blood faint but still present. Up close, the wound on the bear's shoulder looked worse than Alex had realized, swollen and dark at the edges. Infection was setting in. Maria worked quickly, cleaning the wound with practiced efficiency, her hands steady despite the storm's relentless fury outside. Alex kept his eyes on the cub, who watched the scene with wide, unblinking eyes. It huddled close to its mother, its small frame shaking, but it did not try to flee. Somehow it knew this was not an attack. This was help. Minutes stretched into an eternity, but at last Maria secured the final bandage. "That should hold," she said, exhaling sharply. "She'll need antibiotics, but she has a chance now." Hayes nodded, then turned to Alex. "You did good bringing this to us." Alex swallowed past the lump in his throat. "Will she make it?" The ranger studied the unconscious bear before answering. "If the infection doesn't spread, she'll recover. We'll monitor her for a few days, make sure she gets what she needs. But she's strong. She fought to protect her cub, even when she was injured. That kind of determination goes a long way." The words settled something in Alex's chest, a warmth blooming beneath the cold that had gripped him for so long. The mother bear would live. The cub would have a future. It was more than he had dared to hope for when he first stepped into that cave. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to break, the rain tapering into a fine mist, the wind softening into a distant murmur through the trees. As they prepared to leave, Alex took one last look at the cub, who met his gaze with quiet curiosity. He knew he would likely never see them again, but that was okay. Some moments didn't need to be prolonged to be meaningful. Some connections, no matter how brief, had the power to change everything. As they hiked back toward the ranger station, Alex felt something shift within him, a realization settling deep in his bones. He had spent years chasing images, capturing the beauty of the wild through his lens. But for the first time, he understood that the real power of the wilderness wasn't in the photographs. It was in the moments like this, the raw, unfiltered connection between man and nature, the silent understanding that they were not separate but intertwined. By the time they reached the station, dawn had begun to break, casting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean, renewed. Alex glanced toward the forest one last time, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He had come here seeking photographs. Instead, he had found something far more valuable, a purpose, a reason to keep fighting for the creatures that called these wild places home. And he knew without a doubt that this was only the beginning. The days that followed passed in a blur, yet each moment remained etched into Alex's mind with sharp clarity. The mother bear had been transported to a temporary wildlife rehabilitation site deep in the Olympic National Forest, a facility run by specialists who monitored her recovery while ensuring the cub remained by her side. Alex had watched as the tranquilized bear was carefully lifted onto a transport sled, her massive body strapped down to prevent injury. The cub bundled in a soft carrier nearby, its small face peeking through the mesh with wide, fearful eyes. Even then, Alex had felt the weight of something unspoken settle in his chest, an understanding that this wasn't just a passing encounter, it was a turning point. He had always thought of himself as an observer of nature, a photographer who documented life from a distance, but standing there watching the mother bear disappear into the truck that would take her to safety, he realized that distance no longer existed. He wasn't just a spectator anymore. He was part of the story. Back at the ranger station, the storm had finally lifted, leaving behind a world washed clean by rain, the air crisp with the scent of damp earth and pine. The golden morning light filtered through the trees as Alex sat on the wooden steps outside, a hot cup of coffee warming his hands. He could still feel the exhaustion in his limbs, the weight of the past few days pressing against his shoulders. But there was a lightness too, a quiet sense of fulfillment that he hadn't expected. The door creaked open behind him, and Ranger Hayes stepped out, his weathered face calm as he lowered himself onto the step beside Alex. They sat in silence for a moment, both staring out at the endless stretch of forest before them, the trees swaying gently in the morning breeze. "You did a good thing, Carter," Hayes said finally, his voice low but certain. "Not many people would have gone through all that for a bear." Alex exhaled, watching the steam rise from his coffee before taking a slow sip. "Didn't feel like a choice," he admitted. It felt right." Hayes nodded, as if he understood. Maybe he did. "They'll keep her under observation for a few weeks," he continued. "The wound was deep, but she's responding well to treatment. The cub's doing fine too, sticking to her side like glue." A small smile tugged at the corner of Alex's lips at that. The image of the tiny cub pressed against its mother, finding safety in her presence despite everything, stayed with him. "And after that," he asked, "will they release them back into the wild?" Hayes sighed, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. "That's the plan. They'll take them to a remote area away from human settlements, somewhere they can live undisturbed. It's the best chance they've got." Alex nodded slowly. It was the outcome he had hoped for, yet something about it left a strange ache in his chest, a quiet reluctance he couldn't quite name. He had only known the bears for a short time, yet they had altered something inside him, shifted his understanding of the world in a way that couldn't be reversed. He had spent his career chasing wildlife through a camera lens, but now for the first time, he wondered if simply capturing nature was enough. He spent the rest of the morning helping the rangers with small tasks around the station, a quiet way of repaying them for their help, though he knew no words or actions could truly express his gratitude. By midday, his body had finally begun to catch up with the exhaustion, and Hayes had insisted he get some real rest before heading back to civilization. But as Alex lay on the cot in the station's spare room, staring at the wooden ceiling, his mind refused to be still. He thought of the first moment he had seen the mother bear, the raw presence even in pain. He thought of the cub, its tiny body trembling in the dark, trusting the only thing it knew, its mother. He thought of the storm, the endless, merciless storm, and how it had brought them together in ways none of them could have predicted. When he finally drifted to sleep, his dreams were filled with the rustling of trees, the distant roar of thunder, and the soft, steady breathing of something wild beside him. The following afternoon, after making sure he had given the rangers every detail they needed for their continued monitoring, Alex packed his gear and prepared for the hike back to his original campsite. The storm had destroyed much of the trail, but with the sky now clear and the ground drying, the trek would be easier. Hayes walked him to the edge of the station's clearing, pausing as Alex adjusted the straps of his pack. "What's next for you?" the ranger asked, studying him with quiet curiosity. Alex hesitated. A week ago, the answer would have been simple. He would have returned to Seattle, sorted through his photographs, pitched his latest shots to magazines, and planned his next expedition. But now that path felt distant, almost unfamiliar. Out of the mother bear and her cub, of the way the wild had pulled him in not as an observer, but as a participant. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. Then after a pause, "But I think I need to do more than just take pictures." Hayes nodded, as if he had expected as much. "Then you'll figure it out," he said simply, offering a firm handshake. "And if you ever find yourself back in these parts, stop by. You've got a place here." Alex shook his hand, a genuine smile pulling at his lips. "I might take you up on that." With that, he turned toward the forest, retracing his steps through the wilderness that had changed him. The journey back to his camp was different than before, not just because the storm had passed, but because he no longer felt like the same man who had entered these woods days ago. He moved through the trees with a newfound awareness. Every sound, every shift of the wind, every distant call of an animal humming with meaning. The forest was not just a subject for his lens. It was alive, complex, and he had been a part of it in a way he never had before. By the time he reached his camp, the sun was dipping low in the sky, casting golden light over the valley beyond. He set down his pack, pulling out his camera instinctively, but for once he hesitated before raising it to his eye. Instead, he simply stood there, taking in the moment, letting it exist beyond the frame. He had always believed photography was about telling a story, but maybe, just maybe, some stories weren't meant to be contained in images. Some stories were meant to be lived. As he finally lifted the camera and snapped a shot of the fading sunlight against the trees, he made a quiet promise to himself. He wouldn't just be a photographer, he would be an advocate, a voice for the wild places and the creatures that called them home, because now he understood what was at stake. He had felt it in the heartbeat of a wounded bear, in the trusting gaze of a cub, in the unrelenting fury of a storm that had pushed them all together. And as the wind whispered through the trees, he knew his journey was only just beginning. The city felt different. The moment Alex stepped off the train in Seattle, the steady hum of civilization surrounded him. The rush of people moving in calculated steps, the distant wail of car horns, the rhythmic beep of crosswalk signals, the faint murmur of conversations blending into an endless current of noise. It wasn't unfamiliar, yet it felt strangely distant, as though he was observing it from behind glass rather than walking through it. He adjusted the strap of his backpack, shifting his weight as he stepped onto the bustling sidewalk, his boots scuffing against the concrete in a way that made him feel oddly displaced. The scent of rain lingered in the air, but it wasn't the wild, untouched kind that filled the Olympic National Forest. This was the smell of damp asphalt, of city gutters carrying away the remnants of an afternoon drizzle. It should have been comforting. It was home after all, but something inside him had shifted, and now everything felt just a little too sharp, a little too loud, a little too disconnected from what he had just experienced. His apartment was only a few blocks from the station, a loft with exposed brick walls and large windows overlooking the waterfront, a space that had always felt like a sanctuary in the midst of the city's chaos. But when he unlocked the door and stepped inside, the quiet didn't soothe him the way it once had. His gear was still scattered where he had left it. Stacks of photography books lined the shelves, and his laptop sat on the wooden desk by the window, waiting for him to sort through the hundreds of images he had captured before the storm changed everything. But instead of feeling the usual anticipation of sifting through his work, of choosing the perfect shot, he found himself hesitating. He set his pack down carefully by the door, rolling his shoulders as he exhaled, the weight of something unspoken pressing against his chest. His hands found the camera instinctively, the familiar grip solid against his palm. He flipped through the images, each frame revealing breathtaking landscapes, mist curling through dense treetops, a river carving its way through the valley, an eagle soaring against the backdrop of a storm-darkened sky. They were good. More than good. They were the kind of shots that would sell, that would land in glossy nature magazines and coffee table books. But none of them held the moment that had changed him. The bear, the cub, the raw, unfiltered connection he had felt in that cave, kneeling beside a wounded creature that should have seen him as an enemy, but had instead accepted his help. The realization sat heavy in his chest. For years, photography had been his way of experiencing the world, of capturing beauty, of telling stories. But now he wasn't sure if capturing was enough. He needed to do something more than simply observe, more than just frame moments behind a lens. He needed to act. He set the camera down carefully, fingers drumming absently against the table as he stared at the city lights flickering beyond the window. The mother bear and her cub were still out there somewhere, recovering, surviving. And for the first time, he wondered how many others weren't as lucky. How many animals lost their lives because no one was there to help, because no one thought to look beyond the photograph and see the responsibility that came with witnessing something so wild, so vulnerable, so undeniably alive. Before he could second-guess himself, he grabbed his laptop, fingers moving swiftly across the keyboard. He searched for wildlife conservation programs, for advocacy groups, for anything that could bridge the gap between his work and the action he now felt compelled to take. He scrolled through pages of organizations, reading about deforestation, habitat destruction, illegal poaching, climate change. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. But instead of deterring him, it fueled something deep inside, a quiet resolve building with each article, each statistic, each story of animals on the brink of survival. Hours passed in a blur of research, and when he finally leaned back, rubbing a hand over his tired eyes, he knew what he had to do. He had spent his life traveling to remote places, capturing wildlife through his lens, but now he needed to use that lens for something greater. He wasn't just going to take pictures, he was going to tell stories that mattered, stories that could make a difference. And maybe, just maybe, he could help protect the very creatures that had given him a new sense of purpose. The next morning, he sent emails, first to the rangers at Olympic National Park, thanking them for everything they had done, asking for updates on the bear's progress, expressing his interest in staying involved in conservation efforts. Then to various organizations, offering his photography services, his experience, his willingness to be part of something bigger than himself. Some would respond, some wouldn't. But the important thing was that he had started. A week later, as he stood in a quiet coffee shop downtown, sipping a black coffee and flipping through an article on wildlife rescue efforts in Alaska, his phone buzzed. The email was from Maria, the ranger who had helped sedate and treat the mother bear. He opened it quickly, his heart hammering. "Hey Alex, wanted to give you an update. The mother bear is healing well, stronger every day. The cub never leaves her side. They'll be moving them to a more remote release site next week, somewhere safe, away from human interference. She made it. Thought you'd want to know. Thanks again for everything." Maria Alex exhaled slowly, a smile pulling at his lips. She made it. He stared at the words for a long moment, letting them settle, letting them confirm what he had already known deep down. This was what mattered. Not just the photographs, not just the adventure, but the impact. The understanding that what he did, what he captured, could lead to something real, something lasting. He pocketed his phone and finished his coffee, stepping out onto the busy street. But this time, the city didn't feel so disconnected. He wasn't just drifting anymore. He had a direction. And as he walked toward his apartment, his mind was already racing with plans, with new ideas, with the possibilities of what lay ahead. In a few days, he would board another train, heading north toward an animal sanctuary that had agreed to let him document their work. After that, maybe he'd find himself in the Arctic, photographing polar bears whose habitats were disappearing. Maybe he'd travel to Africa, capturing the quiet resilience of elephants living under constant threat of poaching. The path was open, and for the first time in a long time, Alex Carter knew exactly where he was going. The sky stretched endlessly above the Arctic tundra, an expanse of soft blues and grays, the low winter sun casting long shadows across the frozen landscape. The wind carried a sharp bite, whistling over the ice, but Alex Carter barely noticed. He lay prone on a ridge of compacted snow, his camera lens trained on the mother polar bear and her cub, their fur stark against the white horizon. He had been tracking them for days, careful to maintain a respectful distance, moving only when necessary, letting their natural rhythm dictate his own. The cub, still small but growing steadily, bounded through the snow with the kind of untamed joy that only the wild could nurture. The mother watched, patient and protective, her massive paws pressing into the ice as she scanned the horizon for danger. It was a moment of quiet survival, an unspoken testament to resilience, and Alex captured it with the practiced precision of someone who understood that this was more than just an image. The story. Months had passed since his time in the Olympic National Forest, since the storm that had changed everything, since he had made the decision to do more than just observe. He had traveled across continents, documenting creatures on the brink, using his photography not just as art, but as a weapon against ignorance, against destruction. His work had started gaining attention. Articles written about his images, interviews with conservation groups, invitations to speak at forums where people who had spent their lives fighting for the wild gathered to push back against the relentless march of industry, deforestation, and climate change. But standing here out on the ice, none of that mattered as much as the moment itself. The camera was only part of it. The real work was understanding, bearing witness. The mother bear lifted her head, nostrils flaring as she tested the air. Alex tensed, sensing the shift in her posture, and carefully lowered his camera, scanning the landscape for what she had sensed before he had. Then he saw it, far in the distance, a dark blotch moving against the endless white, its silhouette unmistakable. A male polar bear, and he was getting closer. Alex's pulse quickened, his breath steady, but his fingers flexing against the cold metal of his camera. He knew what this meant. Male polar bears, especially lone ones, posed a danger to cubs. If food was scarce, a desperate male wouldn't hesitate to attack, even if it meant facing the wrath of the mother. And in this unforgiving environment, every calorie, every kill, was a matter of life or death. The mother bear turned, positioning herself between the cub and the approaching male. Her shoulders tensed, her head lowering slightly, her dark eyes locked onto the advancing threat. The cub, oblivious at first, finally sensed the tension and stopped playing, hesitating before pressing itself against its mother's thick fur. The air between the bears crackled with silent challenge. The male moved closer, slow and deliberate, testing the limits of how much the mother would tolerate. Alex's instinct screamed at him to stay put, to let nature play out as it always had, to remain an observer rather than an intruder. But something in his chest burned at the thought of just standing there, just watching. He had seen too much already. Animals left to the mercy of forces beyond their control, caught in the crossfire of climate shifts, human interference, dwindling resources. He had sworn to make a difference, and yet here he was, kneeling on the ice, powerless against what was about to unfold. The male took another step forward. The mother let out a deep, warning growl. The cub whimpered. Alex made his decision. Reaching into his pack with swift, measured movements, he pulled out a flare gun, his fingers numb but steady. He had brought it for emergencies. This counted. He braced himself, aimed skyward, and pulled the trigger. The explosion of red fire against the pale sky was instantaneous, a streak of brilliant color shattering the frozen silence. The crack of the shot echoed across the ice, and for a moment all three bears froze. The mother, the cub, the approaching male. Then as the flare burned bright, the male let out a low, uneasy grunt and took a step back, ears flicking in irritation. Another second passed, and then he turned, retreating, his massive form shrinking into the distance until he was nothing but a shadow on the horizon. Alex exhaled slowly, the flare's red glow fading against the clouds. The mother bear watched the retreating male for a long moment before turning to her cub, nudging it gently, as if reassuring it that the danger had passed. The cub responded by pressing its face against her chest, seeking comfort in the warmth of her fur. Alex lowered the flare gun, his breath steady, but his heart still hammering. He had done something he wasn't sure he was supposed to do. He had interfered, but deep down he knew. This world was changing too fast, and the old rules no longer applied. It wasn't enough to simply document anymore. Not when the ice was melting beneath their feet, not when creatures who had ruled these landscapes for centuries were being forced to fight harder than ever just to exist. As he knelt there, the cold pressing in, but his body thrumming with the heat of adrenaline, he thought of the mother bear from the cave, of the cub that had nestled against her in the dim light of the Olympic forest, of the way she had trusted him in her weakest moment. He wondered if she had been released yet, if she had found her way back into the wild where she belonged. He hoped she had. He hoped she was thriving. He turned his camera back toward the mother polar bear and her cub, watching as they moved together through the snow, a quiet strength radiating from the way they walked, side by side, unstoppable in their will to survive. He lifted his lens and captured the moment, not for a magazine, not for fame, because this was what mattered. This was the story he was meant to tell. By the time Alex packed up his gear and made his way back toward the waiting snowmobile, the wind had begun to pick up again, sweeping across the tundra in soft rolling waves. He pulled his scarf tighter around his face, glancing one last time toward the mother and cub, now just specks in the vast white expanse. He smiled. His journey had started in a storm, deep in a forest, where a bear had trusted him when she had every reason not to. Now in the frozen heart of the Arctic, it felt like it had come full circle. But this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning.